Establishing immediate central influence, the English opening immediately contests space and offers flexible development, aiming for a positional advantage. Instantly claiming central space, e5 establishes a robust pawn presence and opens diagonals for bishop and queen development, a classic and principled response to the English opening. A flexible setup, aiming to control central squares and prepare for further piece development, while leaving opening options wide. Developing the knight here mirrors white's intent, immediately contesting central squares and preparing to castle. Establishing a fianchetto often signals intentions for long-term pawn structure control and harmonious piece development. Developing the bishop's diagonal to control the long light-squared diagonal, but potentially weakening the kingside's pawn structure. Unleashing the fianchettoed bishop, aiming its gaze towards the queenside and potentially supporting a central pawn push. A classic fianchetto pair develops, aiming for central influence and robust pawn structures. Solidifying the center and preparing for queenside expansion, this move subtly curbs black's immediate pawn breaks. Solidifying the center and preparing for nf6 or n7 are key ideas now, with the pawn structure becoming quite symmetrical. Knight reroutes to a less active square, perhaps aiming for d4 or f4 later, but sacrificing immediate central influence. Black solidifies the central dark squares, preparing to contest the open e-file. Challenging the central pawn chain immediately, aiming to disrupt black's harmonious development and potentially open lines for attack. Capturing the pawn opens the d-file, creating immediate tactical possibilities for white's pieces. Pioneering forward, this pawn lunges, immediately challenging black's bishop and seizing a crucial central outpost. Retreating the knight to b8 sacrifices valuable tempo and cedes central space, potentially hindering future counterplay. Unleashing a queenside probe, white forces black's king's pawn to concede territory and opens a diagonal for immediate pressure. Sacrificing tempo to gain space, a bold assertion on the queenside. Snatching that pawn opens up surprising lines and creates attacking potential, even if it looks risky. Securing the bishop's control over the queenside diagonal offers crucial counterplay against white's aggressive pawn push. This queen sortie forces the king out of its shell, initiating a positional tug-of-war for central control and open lines. This move reroutes the knight, solidifying the queenside pawn structure while preparing for a more active central role. Solidifying central control, this pawn advance prepares for kingside expansion and pressure. Developing the knight to its most active square, preparing for a central counterthrust, and securing the kingside flank is a sensible plan. Bringing the king to safety unlocks the rook's potential and prepares for central expansion. Securing the king amidst the developing queenside pressure makes perfect sense for safety. Reactivating the knight to the central square enhances piece coordination, eyeing potential breakthroughs. Asserting presence on the open file now aims to disrupt white's queenside advances. Simplifying the position, white aims to free their pieces and prepare for central pawn breaks, while the black queen feels somewhat exposed. Unlocking the c-file, black boldly challenges white's central structure and opens avenues for piece activity. Liberating the queen's path, this capture opens a diagonal, potentially targeting black's underdeveloped kingside. Reclaiming that pawn, black solidifies their central pawn structure, aiming to untangle the knight from its passive placement and prepare for active piece play on the queenside. Positioning the bishop to eye the kingside and support a potential advance of the e-pawn offers subtle yet significant influence. Asserting central control, this knight reclaims contested squares and prepares for aggressive kingside play. Sharpening the queen's central influence, this repositioning prepares to exploit the weakened kingside. Shifting the knight to e6 aims to solidify the center, but it also surrenders dynamic central control and might invite white's kingside expansion. Opening the c-file aggressively repositions the rook, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive pawn structure. Challenging the queenside pawn structure, Ned 4 seeks to disrupt white's harmonious piece arrangement. Initiating a kingside pawn storm opens critical lines, though it weakens your own monarch. Activating the queen to this central outpost disrupts white's intended queenside pressure and eyes weaknesses. Unleashing pressure on the kingside, this pawn thrust seeks to puncture black's defenses and exploit the pinned knight. Opening the f-file for white's rook initiates a critical pawn storm that black's knight on e7 cannot effectively block, demanding immediate defensive repositioning. Reinforcing the kingside defense becomes paramount, preparing a potential pawn storm. Securing the king's escape route anticipates future pawn advances threatening the monarch's current shelter. Rearranging the queen to defend the knight and prepare a kingside pawn thrust. Reinforcing the central pawn chain now, preparing for potential queenside pressure. Exploiting the opened f-file, this pawn thrust aims to shatter black's pawn structure and expose the king. Opening the h-file exposes your monarch. Vigilance is paramount now. A bold push to pry open the kingside, inviting tactical fireworks and potentially exposing black's monarch. This repositioning seeks to activate the knight, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially target weaknesses. Fortifying the king's defenses and preparing for a potential central pawn advance through the newly solid square. Unlocking the center with this pawn thrust demands precise calculation to avoid immediate tactical repercussions. Unleashing a potent knight sacrifice, white seeks to shatter black's pawn shield and expose the vulnerable king. Recapturing the pawn dissolves the central tension, but opens lines for white's pieces. Unlocking the d-file could be the key to an attacking advantage. Reclaiming central influence and preparing for a decisive pawn push on the d-file, this piece repositions for a more dynamic role. Unleashing the bishop to dominate the long diagonal and threaten the unprotected pawn. Activating the bishop to h6 seizes control of a crucial diagonal, subtly threatening white's central pawns. This ambitious pawn thrust seeks to seize territorial advantage, potentially opening lines for attack, but it weakens the queenside structure significantly. Unleashing the queen to disrupt white's pawn structure and expose potential weaknesses. Sacrificing material to expose the enemy king, aiming for a swift mating attack. Capturing the queen sacrifices all defending pieces, a desperate gamble against the looming rook attack. Unleashing the rook to exploit black's exposed king, sacrificing material for initiative. Exposing your monarch to the open diagonal creates a precarious situation, inviting immediate threats. A desperate gambit to ignite complications, forcing black to confront the exposed king. Sacrificing the rook to unleash the queen and attack the exposed king presents a bold, yet potentially perilous, counterplay. Unleashing the queen's power, this check exploits the exposed black king, forcing a concession or further defensive scramble. Preserving the bishop's diagonal offers a glimmer of hope, though the king's exposure is dire. Unleashing a powerful rook sacrifice, white gambles on opening lines to the exposed black monarch. Seeking to evade immediate danger, the king retreats, hoping to find sanctuary among its remaining defenders. Unleashing a decisive check, white forces black's king onto a vulnerable diagonal, initiating the final tactical sequence. Protecting the monarch from the immediate mating net, this retreat sacrifices tempo for breathing room. Unleashing a powerful queen fork, white seeks to shatter black's king defense and exploit the open files. Re-establishing a safe haven, but the exposed king is still a significant concern. Seeking repetition by forking the king and rook, hoping to draw out a blunder. The black king retreats to a slightly safer square, but the queenside pawn structure remains compromised, offering white attacking chances. Exploiting the exposed dark squares around black's monarch is the immediate priority. After repeated checks, maintaining this defensive posture offers scant solace against the inevitable pawn storm.